Hello, everybody, and welcome here to the Wine with Jimmy channel. Thank you for clicking by. This is a slightly different video because I'm going to be looking at the topic of wine fraud, which is more prevalent than you probably are aware of. So yes, welcome to my channel. I do a lot of wine education videos which really fit key text and key syllabus globally to help students with their wine studies. And here I've got my series that begins on wine fraud, and this is actually for the WSET D6 assignment looking at wine fraud. If you have a comment or question, or perhaps you'd like to find out more information about how to access all of the exclusive content on the Wine with Jimmy portal, then please do pop that in the comments section below this video. Otherwise, we're going to rock and roll talking about the naughty world of wine fraud. That opening picture there is actually an image by Peter Rollos from Le Centre de l'Amour, des couverts sub divers emblemes galants et facetieux, which is from the middle of the 17th century. That means the center of love discovered under various gallant and playful emblems. I thought this would be a nice picture to show you of perhaps the adulteration of wine in a pictorial form. You've got lots of things going into this barrel. They've got this gentleman here lying underneath the barrel, glass in hand. Don't need the glass because it's going straight into his mouth. So this is just a nice little playful start on the presentation. Now, the assignment as issued by WSET is what you see in front of your eyes. They do issue 2 assignments per year, one which is due by the end of January and one which is due by the end of August. And these submissions, you'll see there's instructions for the candidates about what to do. The context here is what I'll go through. You can, of course, look at the instructions for candidates at your own time about how to structure the format of the assignment. Wine fraud can be traced back to as long as the Roman era. Wine fraud includes adulteration, counterfeiting, and misrepresentation of wine quality or origin. It occurs in all quality levels, from mass market to super premium wines. In an effort to guarantee authenticity, geographical indication systems have been developed globally. More recently, measures have been taken at a producer or retail level to combat wine fraud and assure consumer confidence. Now, skipping the middle part, just going down to the bottom bit where you'll see there are 3 sections and then the allocation of marks. Candidates must address the following required sections. So they are giving you quite kindly the structure here. First of all, explain the different types of wine fraud that have occurred over the centuries. And there is 35% weighting there, a third of the weighting just over. Part 2 will be discussing the measures that have been taken to combat wine fraud. Make reference to regulation, legislation, and industry practices, 35% again there. And then the last part is always about an opinion and your opinion. So in your opinion, how successful are the current measures at combating wine fraud? And that's for 15%. The remainder, 15%, is around presentation and structure. Okay, so let's have a look at how I'll be formulating my series. We're going through 5 parts in this series. So part 1 will be the history of wine fraud, this video about adulterating wine. Part 2 would be around the history of wine fraud and counterfeiting. Part 3, the history of wine fraud investment scams. Part 4, the measures to take that are taken to combat wine fraud. And then finally, part 5, on measuring success. Parts 2 through to 5 are only available to everybody who subscribes to the Wine Fraud series on Wine with Jimmy. And I will be adding interviews as well with key industry types throughout December 25 and January 2026, which you can log into to watch specific key industry types about their opinions and their experience with wine fraud. As always, please do get in touch if you have a comment, question, or you'd like to find out about how to sign up. The information for that, by the way, actually is in the comment section below this video. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about the wine fraud description, as you can see here. So taking the definition of fraud, first of all, from the Oxford Dictionary, is wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. So we're going to be, of course, applying that to the deception of wine. So we're throwing in wine there for wine fraud. And there are really three types of wine fraud, as we take mostly from the outlines of WSET, so adulterated wine, counterfeiting, and investment. So adulterated wine, this is the most prevalent type of fraud. This is the one where the wines themselves are adulterated, often with cheaper products such as juices, other juices, sometimes with chemicals and sweeteners, often compensating for color and flavor. I'm going to go through this in quite some detail, of course, in this video. And remember that even today, most countries around the world do not even state made from grapes on the label. And many people do not possess the knowledge of what may or may not be in the bottle of wine. Some people do not realize it comes from grapes, right? So this is, therefore, the perception is quite confusing for the general public. And this is actually an issue which we find with sulfur, because really the only ingredient on many wines around the world is that it says contains sulfites. There's nothing else. And of course, it's caused this big negativity about the role of sulfur and sulfur dioxide being used in winemaking, an essential piece of the winemaker's toolkit. However, of course, people will link negative reactions to wine to it, such as headaches, for example, and hangovers, of course, however wrong that may be. Counterfeiting, this is another common type of wine fraud, and it's the relabeling of inferior and cheaper wines to more expensive brands. And we'll talk about some of the, I suppose, movers and shakers in the counterfeiting trade, such as Rudy Kurdogan, for example, plus many others. So that will be a very interesting second part. And then investment. This third category of wine fraud relates to investment wine industry. So really almost the commodity of trading wines. An investment of this, an example of this is when wines are offered to investors at excessively high prices by a company who then go into, say, a planned liquidation, or there are Ponzi schemes. So I'll go through some of those as well. But we're now focusing on adulterated wine. And that's where we look here at that required section that you'll see on the top of this one. So this is the explain the different types of wine fraud that have occurred through the centuries. Yes, we just talked about those. And we're going to go through 35% of the presentation. That's just over 1,000 words that are going to be dedicated to this section. The command verb here is explain. You'll see I've put the command verb at the bottom just to give you a clear indication of how you should be approaching this. So we are looking to clarify how or why something happens through cause and effect. So wine fraud that has happened through history, and how it happens. You talk about because and it leads to, therefore, and always link fact to outcome as well. So because of this results in, and this leads to, and so on. Let's go into adulterating wine. As I mentioned, this really is, I think, the most important part, really about discussing the history of wine fraud. And there is a case here that some of the topics that I'm talking may actually be not solely in one of the categories, but may spill over into counterfeiting as well in some instances. Let's talk about where the WSET assignment actually said since Roman times. They went back to that description. And so let's begin at that point. And I like to sort of, I like to have this slide up of Monty Python, The Life of Brian. Classic scene here with John Cleese and this and Michael Palin, Eric Idle. Fantastic scene about what have the Romans ever done for us? And of course, people put their hands up saying sanitation, wine, and so on, roads. And of course, there's a list of things. So we're going to talk about the wine aspect. Around the Roman influence, of course, the Roman Empire, stemming from the Roman city of Rome, spanned across the whole of Western Europe at its heyday and well into Eastern and Central Europe as well. And now, adapting wine was something that the Romans were rather good at. It was seen as common practice. And probably not adulterating wine for personal gain, but moreover trying to improve the wine. Now, in these earlier times, this was actually known as sophistication of the wine. It's the common word for many kinds in food and beverage fraud. But there is a contradictory approach to meddling with wine. So despite advocating the use of herbs, spices, seawater, and sweeteners, Columella, who was a very key thinker and writer, a polymath of the age, was the writer of De Re Rustica, which is The Country Matters. And his contemporaries also claimed that the finest and rarest wines should definitely not be adulterated. So yes, they would talk about the positive use of seawater and chalk and things like herbs and spices. But in fact, the very best ones should be as authentic as possible. A quote here: "We regard as the best wine any kind which can keep without preservative, nor should anything at all be mixed with it by which its natural savour would be obscured, for that wine is most excellent." Sounds a little bit like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which is given pleasure by its own natural quality. So the finest and purest wines, like Falernum and the original Cru system coming from Campania, were very much imbibed by the wealthy, the noble, and the rich. They certainly could afford to value provenance and authenticity and use them as a means to display their wealth, kind of posturing how much money they have and their access to wealth. And we have this, of course, across history in great empires and kingdoms. Of course, the Phoenicians with obtaining the special dye from a special type of mollusk in the sea, very tiny drops of this to create that purple dye, classic in Phoenician culture and heritage, for example. Another form of really sort of showing off one's wealth. Now, dilution of wine during this time was quite common with water. A common practice. Now, this is because, in fact, in great empires such as the Romans and the Greeks, it was seen as a way of potentially making water safer, but also making the wine more elegant, because there may be distinctive notes about the wine. It might be, I don't know, a little bit oxidized. It might be a high in volatile acid. So the kind of blending with water is to sort of moderate it. And it was often discussed that if you were to drink wine neat without mixing it with water, this was seen as a barbaric practice, only fit for those barbarians that would sit subjugated by the Roman Empire or Greek empires, or would sit outside the territories, of course. A little bit of overt propaganda, talking about calling them barbarians, certainly in that point. Now, Master of Wine, Jancis Robinson, of course, author of The Purple Pages and a fairly important critic in the world of wine, actually calls the act of adding water to stretch out or dilute the wine possibly the oldest form of wine fraud in the book. And it could be that would be in terms of
producing bigger volumes of it, diluting it to get more and sell your product and so on. That's where we're sort of now playing devil's advocate and talking about the negative effect. So there you are in terms of that sort of, I'm talking about the Roman catalyst. Now, I started with the Romans because of the mention in the WSET text. However, you could go back further to look at wine, certainly even in China, which predates the cradle of wine, Georgia, in not a wine product, but actually a product which would include wine. It'd be a multifaceted style, but heavily adulterated. Who knows if it was wine then adulterated? It could be the other way round. Greeks, of course, as well, are worth mentioning, just because this is another form of adulterating wine, potentially, and that is in terms of the pine resin that one finds in the production of, say, Retsina, with the Savatiano grape variety in Greece. And the origins of Retsina certainly trace back to the Greek cities and ancient Greece, and this practically gave birth to the unique flavor tradition of pine wine. Initially, pine resin was used to seal the clay amphora, keeping air out and preserving the wine during transport. And we actually know it's not just the Greeks that practiced this. The Phoenician Empire also did this, because we have found wrecks, sunken ships of Phoenician seafarers with lots of amphora preserved very well in the water, but sealed with pine. So this is something certainly that was being practiced by major empires. Resin would certainly leave its mark, however, because you'll get a very distinctive pine aroma, a resinous characteristic, of course, as well. And there is discussions around the Greeks utilizing it to flavor their wine, to adult their wine, because then when the Romans would come through, they would pilfer through and they wouldn't take these because they were distinctively piney. So this adaptation would mean that it would be very much used to the palates of the Greeks, but the Romans wouldn't touch them. So potentially that's a positive wine fraud if you think about it. Medieval England. So we're now going to move into, we know there was the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and we moved into Dark Ages and the medieval age. In a really interesting piece by Lars Homburg of the University of Copenhagen, in a book which is called Wine Fraud, which was published in 2010. There's an interesting piece here that was discussing the reign of King Edward III in England. So on November the 8th, in 1327, King Edward III, in a letter to the mayor and the sheriffs of London, complained that the cities of vintners and taverners, so wine sales and taverns and inns, will mix weak and corrupt wine with other wine and sell the mixture at the same price as good as pure wine, not allowing their customers to see whether the wine is drawn in measures from casks or otherwise. So he was frustrated at this deceiving practice. As a preventative measure, the English tavern keepers were ordered to keep their barrels visible to the customers in order to keep them from tampering with the wine while drawing it. And in 1419, so a good sort of 70, 80 years later, William Harold from Hampton in England, so this is now a part of Greater London, was sentenced to the pillory for false romanancy, that is the counterfeiting of Greek wine, which links back to what we were just talking about, interestingly. The next one's around important issues, and this is talking about the production of port. This is from an interesting article that is found on the World of Fine Wine. Now, all the bibliography is going to be available only on my online e-learning platform. So I've drawn a lot of key text and key publications online, and you'll be able to get access to those if you sign up to the e-learning platform for the Wine Fraud series. So let's talk about port. One of the more reputable merchants, John Croft, noted that much port was sweetened with raisin wine. A quote here: generally made of the very worst sort of raisins that come from Smyrna, which is modern-day Izmir, Turkey, compounded with British spirits extracted from malt. This would, in essence, be somewhat of a witch's brew if there ever was one. Charles Luddington, in his exhaustively detailed study, which was The Politics of Wine Britain 2013, cites a French visitor to England. This gentleman was called Pierre-Jean Grosley, claiming that he had it on good authority that the port wine served in London taverns in 1765 was basically just a mishmash of things like wild berries, beer, turnip juice, and litharge, which was lead oxide. Also, in the University of Copenhagen Wine Fraud by Lars Homburg, we have an extensive essay on port by a gentleman called Wright, and the art of detecting adulteration in wine recounts how on one autumn day in London in 1794, approximately 300 pipes, which is basically a barrel containing about 480 litres, nearly 2 times the size of a barrique today. These 300 pipes of port wine were sold to be used by the Army, Navy, and a number of hospitals. The price per pipe was £35, but the purchase price in Portugal, with the addition of freight, insurance, and customs duty, amounted to at least £45 per pipe. Thus, the conclusion was rather straightforward. The pipes did not contain pure port wine. Maybe some was drawn off and sold separately, and then other things were filled within. And then we get to where chemistry and key thinkers start to actually shape the industry about these issues of wine fraud. This is quite interesting. A lot of this information comes from Rebecca Gibbs' book, which is Vintage Crime. This is around the chemist Frédéric Accum that you see here on your slide. There's the picture of him on the left, who was alive in the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century and wrote something called a treatise to art of making wine. So this is around the time that food and wine were certainly becoming intellectualized. So you'd find people starting to talk about the quality and the breed of wine, and really going into details about gastronomy. So the growing awareness was increasing, and it was becoming clear that a glass of Bordeaux or a glass of port might contain more than just the grapes from the region that it should come from. And this often might be with ingredients that were not appetizing. Like I mentioned, maybe some iron and lead, for example. In 1820, Frédéric Accum, who was a German chemist living in central London, opened the can of worms, lifted the lid on the adulteration of food and drink. And this opened the public's eyes to the scale of adulteration that was occurring in everyday products, from bread, ale to wine, and even British custard. The first print run of 1,000 copies of the book that you see on your slide sold out within less than a month, though this is an exceptionally successful launch of a book. Suddenly, adulteration of food and wine was in the spotlight. Now, this is nothing new, but there is certainly the limelight being shone upon this topic. In 1682, a book published for London wine merchants described how to really change wines and improve the unpalatable. It was republished 5 times over the course of the next century, so it was popular. In Paris, wine merchants had been the subject of an expose published anonymously in 1770, which claimed that in 1 year alone, they had brought close to 8 million litres or 30,000 casks of vinegar into the city before cleaning it up, and potentially fatal but sweet tasting lead acetate was added to it. It wasn't until the publication, though, of Frederick's book that the mainstream press certainly started to take note fully. And there is a good quote, I think, from his moral stance on food adulterations, as he claims, and this is it. The man who robs a fellow subject of a few shillings on the highway is sentenced to death, while he who distributes a slow poison to a whole community escapes punishment. We then move on, going in towards the 19th century, and we're going to talk about the French Minister of Agriculture of this time, Jean-Antoine Chaptal, who lent his name to chaptalization. This is the common practice of adding dry sugar beet, into wine to increase the sugar, to therefore increase potential alcohol. We know that really in the start of the 19th century, wines in France were likely to be below 10% alcohol. So the addition of sugar certainly would bring that into more noticeable alcohol levels that we're used to today. Now, chaptalization has generated quite a significant amount of discontent and controversy over the years, certainly in the French wine industry, due to the advantages that the process is perceived to give producers in poor climate areas. It would bring the competition of a poor climate area towards a more suitable climate area. In response, violent demonstrations by protesters in 1907 occurred, and the French government began regulating the amount of sugar that can be added to wine, and we still feel the effects of this today. It is heavily regulated in the European Union, and in fact it is forbidden in many parts, which are the warmer locations. Now, talking about a bit of history and wine fraud would not be complete without talking about champagne. So we have a gentleman called Lamar in his self-published work called La Révolution Champenoise, and he berated negociants who were making champagne from cheaper grapes. As early as the 1820s, wines that were made far from this small portion of northern France were being called champagne, and even in other countries, eventually, such as Catalonia, for example, champagne, the original carvers. Imitation, is sometimes something which is rather flattering, but of course, the champagne industry was not happy about this at all, and of course, called it fraudulent. You may have seen the movie about Madame Clicquot and the steps she would take to try and protect the authenticity of her product. The Veuve, or the widow Clicquot, took legal action against a wine producer based in Metz, who was exporting fake champagne to the major market of Russia. Now, rulings were made throughout the 19th century that only sparkling wines harvested and produced in Champagne region could use the name. But to be honest, the abuse continued to happen, and it all came to head in the early 20th century, 1911, where this picture is actually from. You can see the Revolution en Champagne here, 1911, in Epernay. Now, we will talk about a real sort of discontent in the area, because there was a book also called The Black Book of the Assassins of Champagne, published in 1911 as well. It kind of acted as a who's who of wine fraud for local growers. Basically, a real pivotal book to outline those who were increasingly guilty for adulterating the wines and for committing wine fraud. And it was no coincidence that many of the wine producers on the receiving end of grape growers' fury in weeks that were followed were certainly listed in that black book. There were cellars that were attacked in places like Ai and other villages along the Marne Valley in the winter of 1910, spring of 1911. And in the months preceding the main riots in Ai, villagers in Auvilliers, which is the birthplace, of course, of the Benedictine monk of Dom Perignon, had discovered that 4 600-litre barrels of fake wine were going to be transported under the cover of dark. So we have this real emerging worry that comes from this, of course. Now, the next stuff is really going overseas. We're going to be talking about American Prohibition. A lot of this comes from the excellent book, which is The Wine Bible from Karen McNeil. From 1920 to 1933, alcohol was banned in the United States during Prohibition. Sometimes some of the states were earlier than the dates that I gave you, and some have continued on after the Repeal Act. Wineries were only allowed to make wine for sacramental religious purposes and also medical purposes. And if you hired the right legal firm, you'd be able to sort of get round the legal action of not producing wine. But Americans didn't just stop drinking wine during this time that alcohol was illegal. There was a booming black market that arose to meet the demands of thirsty Americans who did not believe in the temperance movement nor prohibition. Sometimes offenders were scamming the customers, sometimes they were deceiving the US government, and sometimes it was both. During Prohibition, rather than fooling people into thinking they were getting a higher quality of wine that they actually were, the focus was on making it seem to the authorities like they weren't selling wine at all. One of the most popular methods was actually creating these solid bricks of non-alcoholic grape concentrate and then selling them to consumers with a strongly tongue-in-cheek warning not to dissolve the brick in water and not to leave it to ferment, or they would be breaking the law. So perhaps doing their due diligence, but of course there is reading between the lines. A lot of the fake wines being sold were not as safe as the wine bricks. Because it was an illegal product, consumers had less options for where they could buy and also less options of where they could complain. So they had to really purchase at high prices and run the risk of drinking a product at that time. One of the most commonly sold options was actually denatured alcohol, which had been redistilled and dyed. Shocking. There's a lovely picture there, I say lovely, of North Cucamonga Winery. So Cucamonga in SoCal, Southern California, and wine being thrown away at this North Cucamonga Winery. And then finally into contemporary times, and this is an interesting discussion to, of course, lead into. And this is talking about the Austrian antifreeze scandal in 1985, also called the diethylene glycol scandal. Now, in the 1980s, it saw a climate change in Austria that made for a rough time in grape growing. Yields were naturally higher, the grapes couldn't get to full ripeness, understanding the vineyards was not as good as today, for example. So in 1982, it was a terrible vintage for Austrian importers. There wasn't enough quality wine being produced to meet the requirements of their contracts to suppliers across Europe. The wine was thin and sour, nothing like what was expected from the German market. So some people took matters into their own hands and decided to cheat to improve the garbage wine being made. Typical sweeteners weren't imitating enough, so they wanted to do something else which would carry out the work, and they found it. West Germany had been the victim of illegal sweeteners before Italian wines in 1980 and 1982. And with the new technology of 1985, there were laboratories that had begun running tests on bottles of wine for quality control. On June the 27th, they found a bottle of Austrian 1983 Röster Auslese in Stuttgart supermarket that contained diethylene glycol. More bottles from Austria were found with the chemical. Outrage ensued. It really whipped up a fury because there were many producers that were listed in this scandal. Diethylene glycol, also known as DEG on your slide, is a chemical used for antifreeze. It's pretty lethal when it's served neat, of course, as you would guess. But at lower levels, it can do some serious damage as well. Most of the bottles that were found only contained a few grams per litre. So you would die of alcohol poisoning before you would die of the DEG effect in one sitting. But just 0.1 grams per litre is enough to do brain and kidney damage with long-term consumption. Some of the bottles could do damage to a greater amount. 14 grams per litre could possibly kill you. And a bottle of 1981 Welsh Riesling Beerenauslese from Burgenland had 48 grams per litre. Drink that whole bottle, and of course, you will not be surviving. Almost immediately that it came out that the Austrian government knew about the tainted wine 3 months before it was discovered in West Germany, the Austrian agricultural minister Gunther Hayden claimed that they had been informed by the courts and the authorities of each province in April, and they should be held responsible for not informing the public. But everybody, especially the Conservatives, were calling for the socialist Hayden to step down. After initially denying any knowledge, the West German government eventually admitted they had been informed by Austria on May the 10th. It wasn't until the scandal had made international news that they pulled every bottle of Austrian wine off the shelves for destruction, and further importing was banned. And it completely wrecked the Austrian industry. The essence of green pepper is next. South Africa's second biggest and best known producer, which is KWV, and this is an important historical producer because it was the original cooperative which ran the industry from 1919 to 1990. And they had to fire two much lauded winemakers after it was discovered they had adulterated the Sauvignon Blanc of KWV. This was Gideon Theron and Ian Nieuwholt, winemakers at the time for the Laborie Sauvignon Blanc 2004 and the KWV Reserve Sauvignon Blanc. They were adding flavour to their wine vats. More than 60,000 litres of wine worth about 1 million rand, at the time about 128,000 euros, was destroyed. Under South African law, a person who adds illegal substances to a wine are liable for a prison term as well as a fine. They both were imprisoned and released, I think, after a matter of months. The flavour they added was green pepper to make the Sauvignon Blanc more pyrazine green. So it was green pepper into the Laborie and pyrazine into the Reserve. Both are natural substances, but both are illegal. So KWV chief at the time, Willem Bernard, stressed that the winemakers acted alone and was not aware of any manipulation of the wines at any stage. He called the incident traumatic. And the affair allows a comprehensive year-long investigation by South African Wine and Spirits Board across the whole South African industry. 25% of Sauvignon Blancs were tested. And this is what came up, of course. In November 2003, the industry was thrown into turmoil, as we mentioned. And it was the veteran South African journalist Michael Fridhon who suggested that we had issues. So this was massive, of course, and we had, of course, KWV being really thrown in disrepute with this, but it's another adulteration. You could argue then, why would they do that? This is really off the back of the success of Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand with the likes of Cloudy Bay and Montana and Oyster Bay, with very high pyrazine styles, certainly from the 1980s onwards. So an emulation, that imitation, a form of flattery, but of course, a form of a prison sentence. And then we talk a little bit here about Georges Duboeuf. In the late 1960s, the famous négociant in Beaujolais and Burgundy, Georges Duboeuf, successfully developed and promoted the concept of Beaujolais Nouveau. Now, vintners would today rush to sell their new Beaujolais on the third Thursday of November. And this makes it available, therefore, for the US Thanksgiving. And Duboeuf, behind that's very important. The Duboeuf industry sells around 30 million bottles of Beaujolais wine each year. It's about 1/5 of the total production. But in 2006, Georges Duboeuf was convicted of fraud. He had mixed inferior grapes into his vintage single grape wines. No one detected the fraud by the taste of the wines. France's Consumer Protection Agency caught it through a routine audit. Duboeuf said that the mixing was unintentional and none of the blended wines had reached consumers. You be the judge and jury. Further French problems, Red Bicyclette. Now, in the 2004 film Sideways, there's something called the Pinot effect. That is the mass global demand for Pinot Noir due to the real sort of waxing lyrical about Pinot by Paul Giamatti in that movie. The US company Gallo began marketing a wine called Red Bicyclette, made from grapes sourced and bottled in France by the Sierre d'Arc cooperative to placate the US market. And the US market couldn't get enough of the stuff. From January 2006 to March 2008, 18 million bottles were sold in the US, and no one guessed that anything was awry. In fact, it was the French authorities that spotted the deception, not anything in America. They realized that Red Bicyclette made use of 1/3 more Pinot Noir than was produced in the whole of the Languedoc. So what they found out, that it was actually a wine that was utilizing Carignan, Merlot, and even Syrah, and only a little bit of Pinot Noir. Now, naturally, questions were asked of Gallo's wine control board. They couldn't smell it wasn't Pinot. The color would have been darker, certainly. Did that not give it away? But the funny thing was, as scandals go, it might not as well ever happened. No one appeared to care very much. The French thought it frightfully amusing, and they thought themselves, of course, very clever for able to sort of hoodwink the gullible Americans. And I mean, that is if they have been hoodwinked, of course. And consumers in the States thought it was rather funny. And it was not something of big wine fraud. Anyway, so there were fines with the cooperative that were dished out. Talking of wine fraud, we must talk about the Brunello wine scandal of 2013, often coined Brunellopoli or Brunello Gate. Italian police and the Inspectorate for the Suppression of Fraud, ICQRF, uncovered 75,000 litres of wine labelled Brunello do Montalcino, 90,000 litres of supposed Rosso do Montalcino, and 2,350 fake labels. Large quantities of the fake wine were allegedly sold between 2011 and 2013. Alarms were raised by the Consorzio of Brunello de Montalcino. Now, the president of the consortium at the time, Fabrizio Bindocchi, explains how the fraud came to light. We control the production of sales to our members. In going over the figures, they found a discrepancy in the sales of one producer and a veritable paper trail of documentation of which the owner of the winery had no knowledge. So we immediately informed the police, who intervened. Fortunately, no wine had yet made it to the market. It has been reported in various sources that the fraudster was a well-known enologist. But Bindocchi says that's not true. He's not an enologist, he's a scoundrel. Now, after he left the consortium, he offered his service with dealing with legal documentation to small producers of the zone where he committed his fraud. Next, it's going back to France, and we're talking about Jean-Claude Froment. Now, in 2015, the president of a Chablis producer was put in jail after it came out that he was tainting his Chablis wines with juice from Provence and the Rhône. This scam went on for 10 years. Jean-Claude Froment, the CEO of Maison Froment in Ligny-le-Châtel in the Yonne, was remanded in custody. And he was accused of using wines from the south and calling the wines Chablis. The non-Chablis wines are believed to come from Provence, as we mentioned, and the investigation began 6 months after the tax department discovered irregularities. So, 10 years of researching. Froment's cellarmaster and freight company were also investigated but not jailed. And Chablis wine growers were in shock over the news. They said that it could be damaging for Chablis, lots of the people out here, and they were putting their faith in the investigation. And the last slide that I will talk about here is of Guillaume Reichwert. And this is where we go to the Rhône Valley in France. The extent of the large-scale wine fraud was discovered in Côte de Rhône, amounting to some 66.5 million bottles of counterfeit wine. So this is one, certainly, of where you've got some adulteration happening, but could also be counterfeiting as well. So it was claimed to be a massive misuse of the Côte de Rhône label by French authorities. And this was Guillaume Reichwert, the CEO of France's largest bulk wine negociant, Raphael Michel, was arrested on suspicion of passing off cheap wine from outside the Rhône as Côte de Rhône, as well as wine from the Châteauneuf-du-Pape AOP. The scam shook both the French and UK trades when it was first discovered in 2017. And Britain was one of the main consumers. So they've likely been the primary victims of the fraud, which is becoming increasingly a major problem, as we know. French authorities now estimate that 15% of the annual output of Côte de Rhône between 2013 and 2016 was counterfeit. And France's consumer fraud body, the Direction Générale de la Concurrence, de la Consommation et de la Répression de Fraude, DGCDRF, reported that around 50 million hectolitres of wine from the Piolenc negociant Raphael Michel was sold. So the commercial value of the fake Châteauneuf-du-Pape was believed to have earned somewhere in the region of 7 million euros for the company, which is a crazy amount. So this is a big French wine fraud. Its deception is very poignant as it comes from France's most successful and longest running negociants, and also from the birthplace of the AOC system, Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which often really sort of postures itself at being very good at protecting its name. Now, producer associations from the Côte de Rhône and Châteauneuf-du-Pape have joined the civil case against Reichwert, claiming that all the alleged fraud has damaged the image of the region, of course. So Rickwert eventually made a 1.5 million bail and was barred from having anything to do with the company whilst it was being investigated. It was widely thought around that time around 300,000 hectolitres, and several major contractors, including the huge supermarket chain of Carrefour, were affected, and they actually cancelled their contracts, of course, with the wine company. So that brings me to a conclusion, looking at this history of wine fraud, talking about the adulteration of wine, but kind of moving into counterfeiting as well. Now, it's not exhaustive, it's not exclusive. It would be great to hear from you if you have anything to add about certain wine fraud in the form of adulteration in the markets that you reside in around the world. Please give me the information. It'd be great to hear from it. I'll do some research and see if I could do some special videos about that specific topic. If you do have any other comments or questions and you'd like to get in touch about how to access the bibliography for this video and all of the exclusive videos in this series, please do go across to the Wine with Jimmy e-learning platform, and the information for that is found in the description of this video below. I've been Jimmy Smith. Ciao for now, and if you do find yourself in the UK, come and say hello for a glass, or bottle. Ciao.